as a matter of introduction to the topic, I think it's important to bear in mind that adequate, affordable and safe water is fundamental to economic growth and human capital development. However, we know that the investment needs to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goal 6 have been estimated to be 3 times what has been historically invested in the sector. So the annual investment gap for achieving SDG 6 in low-income countries in particular is about 500 billion for the period 2023-2030, as estimated by UCNAD in 2023. So there's been a lot of advocacy for mobilizing greater amounts of funding for the sector and for leveraging financing to bridge the financing gap. The OECD, for example, was a key player in the publication of a report from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which suggested that, yes, we need to mobilize more funding for bridging the gap, but we also need better quality funding that is patient, long-term, and that seeks to have positive effects throughout the economy. So in that sense, that report and others have called for a greater role of government and public development bank funding, pointing to the fact that they have a key role to play in providing such qualitative finance. What we note is that public development banks at national level have dedicated a fairly small share of their portfolio to date to financing the water sector. Whereas MDBs, on average, multilateral development banks dedicate about 10% of their portfolio to water. The share that PDB dedicates is much smaller, in the region of 2%. So in order to boost this greater investment in the sector by national public development banks, there has been several efforts in the past. The Water Finance Coalition was set up in the context of the Finance in Common Summit a few years ago and spearheaded by the EFD. So we will have the opportunity to hear more about what has been achieved to date with the Water Finance Coalition. However, what we would like to launch today is an OECD-led initiative entitled the Public Development Banks for Water, which will build on the early success of the Water Finance Coalition and will seek to continue similar activities. So we will deploy 3 main types of activities. First, we will seek to establish a thriving community of practice, bringing together public development banks, particularly national public development banks, as well as bilateral and multilateral development banks, donors, country governments, knowledge partners such as NGOs and academia, which are aligned with the objectives of the initiative. This will be done through regular meetings and managing an active community on LinkedIn or via other channels. We will also seek to prepare analytical work on topics that can help foster PDB engagement in the water sector. The Water Finance Coalition, for example, has published a number of reports looking at current share of investment by PDBs in the sector, but also looking at specific themes such as how to mobilize climate finance by PDBs for water. Next year, we plan to cover topics such as how PDBs can support investment in freshwater ecosystem restoration, building on the examples of numerous public development banks that are already doing so, such as the Caisse des Dépôts in France or BNDES in Brazil, from whom we will hear specifically in the session today. We will also explore other topics, such as how equity in the allocation of the investments by public development banks can be fostered, and that is a topic that will be examined in the run-up to the UN 2026 Water Conference. That will be a key opportunity to bring together this experience of public development banks and highlight the role that they can play. Finally, as part of the initiative, we will also be able to provide specific support at national level to PDBs that volunteer for this support. And we will seek to help them identify specific barriers they may face to invest more in water and to overcome such barriers. This will be done in the context of policy dialogues on water so that the banks themselves can be engaged, but also more broadly government authorities so as to seek to address constraints in a holistic manner. So this is just a brief overview. I would say watch this space, and today's discussion will allow us to give more substance to what is needed, what role PDBs can play, or other comparable public financing models. We will hear, for example, about the AQUES model in Spain, which is a revolving fund supported by the government, which has invested significantly in water over the years. We will also hear from examples of public development banks in Brazil, South Africa, and Vietnam to understand how they're currently investing in water security, what challenges they face, and how they have benefited in the past from external support, including from the Water Coalition or Water Finance Coalition, or how they could benefit going forward from such support. And in order to kickstart this conversation, as I mentioned, we are looking to engage also academia and other aligned partners. So I would like to invite for a keynote speech Dr. Thomas Marois, who is Canada Research Chair in Public Banks and Professor of Political Economy at McMaster University. He will deliver a keynote speech, and then we will have an eminent panel joined by Lionel Goujon, Head of Water and Sanitation at the French Development Agency, Luciene Machado, who's Deputy Managing Director at BNDES, Trung and Nguyen Hoang, who's Director of Foreign Loan Department at the Vietnam Development Bank, Johann Lubbe, who's Head of Water Partnerships Office in DBSA, Development Bank for South Africa. And we will hear from Josefina Maestu, who's International Water Affairs Advisor in the Ministry of Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge in Spain, as some of you might be sitting. So with this, I'd like to invite Thomas to join in, share his slide, and provide some introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure. Let me find my slides here. There we are. And I appreciate your comments and the context you've set for the discussion today. It really helps me a lot, and I appreciate that. It sets a scene for what I would like to talk about. And this particular panel, I think, is really prescient, and it captures a lot of what is going on today. And I'll touch on it a bit in terms of the Finance for Development Conference, but there's a lot of strong wording around the title of this session and the question of public development banks, water, and the SDGs in general. Before beginning, the material that I'll be presenting today is not mine alone. I work with a group, the Municipal Services Project, and the work presented is very much a product of collaboration with Dave McDonald, Queen's University, and Susan Spronk at University of Ottawa in Canada.
Thomas, I think your connection might be a little bit...
I think.
Thomas, I think your connection is a bit slow. So perhaps if you shut off your camera, that might help a bit, because you're slurred a bit. Yeah, thank you.
Is my camera off now?
Not yet.
Is that... one moment. Let me see.
If you go on your image, on the image of yourself.
Sorry, now I've lost the
Zoom. Okay, seems a bit better. So if you yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much.
Okay, is that all right now? Let's try
Yeah,
that.
that's better. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I have to present this to you from my hotel room in Sevilla right now. So I'm dependent on the common network. Um, but let me just continue. I hope that tell me if it's not coming through clearly enough, please let me know. Um, but we've been working in this notion of the need for greater public-public collaboration with public banks, among public banks and water. And in general, we put forward the argument that in terms of the SDGs in general, that there is no pathway to financing them at the pace and scale on the terms needed for just transitions that won't, in one way or another, go through the world's public development banks. And that is forcefully recognized in the Sevilla Compromiso, the Sevilla Commitment, with several paragraphs reinforcing this exact point that we need the world's public banks to work together and work better together to deliver on the SDGs in general. And this is probably nowhere more evident than with water, given the significant role of governments and the potential role of public development banks in helping to deliver on SDG 6. And what our research has shown is that there is significant capacity for public banks to work with government and public water operators to deliver on SDG 6. We have good reason for doing that. We produced two books looking at this topic. On the left, the public banks, public water, was published in 2022 on Europe. And then we just released several months ago a similar type book, but looking at the global south. Through both of these books, there are 18 different case studies, everywhere from the Nordic region to Tanzania, Vietnam, including a case study of one of your speakers today as well, Germany, Argentina. So it's really quite broad coverage. And we worked collaboratively with each of the regional public banking associations in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America to deliver on these case studies. Obviously, I'm not going to cover each one of these, but I do want to share a little bit of motivations and then some of the lessons, the positive lessons and cautions from the case study research. But we were really motivated for this research of these two books in recognizing what Sophie started with is that there's a real need for greater long-term investments in water, insufficient government spending, and the fact that water and sanitation, it's a funny term, but lumpy investment. It's kind of often quite large projects, a bit complicated sometimes, not always, but requires significant commitments. But at the same time, there's been relatively little private sector investment, and where there have been PPPs, particularly in low income and poorer countries, or in the areas where there's the most need, these have really not delivered and have been subject to significant social contestation, expensive, slow, and so on. At the same time, in my area, so my colleagues are more the water people, I'm more the public banking guy. We recognize that in general, and this is something that the Finance and Commons Summit has really supported on, there's been a lack of research in general on public banks, even less on linkages between public banks and public water. So we're very curious about what is going on with public banks and public water and the potential of PPCs, public-public collaborations, but also a desire to connect these really quite siloed areas of research. So in most of the chapters, not all of them, we tried to bring together a water person with a finance or a public banking research and have them work together to deliver on the chapter. There are some cautionary tales that have come up in the research. As Sophie mentioned, and in almost every one of the case, I'm sure all the case studies, to be frank, there is still large gaps in infrastructure and water infrastructure. And it's important to make note and make clear that public development banks alone cannot solve the problem. They're not a silver bullet, but they must be matched with direct government interventions, fiscal transfers, and so on. a number of the case studies, and these are some of the important tales that we need to bring forward into the forum that Sophie was talking about. That really became a barrier that can be, I think, easily solved. In quite a number of cases, there was a lack of coordination with governments. Different parts of government that required approvals weren't talking to each other, or there was a delay in approvals. And so the water operator was trying to get something done, but it took too long. And by the time they got approval from one arm of government, they had passed the deadline for another arm, having to restart the whole process over again. And then relatedly, in some of the cases, there was no explicit government guarantee for the loans that were being provided to water operators through the public development banks. And this created certain challenges and hesitations on the side of public development banks to expand lending when they could, for fear of impacts. And I'll touch on that in a second. Relatedly, and going back to PDBs can't do it alone, we can't lend our way out of this infrastructure challenge in and of itself. There will be debt traps you can get caught into. In the non-EU countries, exchange rate fluctuations and foreign currency loans were a large concern in terms of the MDBs lending either directly to the water operators or to the national development banks. And then in the EU, ironically, the power of rating agencies seemed to be a significant barrier insofar as some of the banks explicitly privileged the maintenance of the AAA credit rating over lending to water. And this goes back to the government guarantee. Because they didn't have an explicit guarantee for water, then they reduced the percentage of lending to water operators in order to protect the AAA rating. And then other sort of related concerns around competition law, state aid rules, and sort of larger questions around bankability, market terms, and so on that kind of feed into a reticence for a number of the different public development banks to lend into the water sector. But there were obviously some promising elements to the research that we found. And clearly, and across all the cases, the public development banks were able to provide patient, long-term, low-cost, and appropriate financing. So concessional, cross-subsidized, often giving, mixing with grants or payment-free periods and so on, which was obviously very important. But also offering, in some cases, much, much smaller credits to small communities or community water operators that simply wouldn't be available from any other bank, private or public. And so they were able to deliver to, in much smaller quantities, but very significant for rural communities. Lend in domestic currency. In some cases, they were providing universal lending to the public sector, meaning that they could lend to water, but not only water, they could tie it to questions of sewage or transport infrastructure. And so they had a broad, universal understanding of the public sector. Then we saw quite a number of cases where there were, direct democratic ownership and governance, accountability and transparency involved. And then significantly, in most of the cases of the public banks, they really had a strong sense of expertise and knowledge in the infrastructure sector and water, which wasn't evident. And a number of the interviews said that they didn't find with the private banks that they had dealt with. And relatedly, then strong social mandates, the ability to collaborate, and then lend on a social mandate rather than a policy maximizing mandate. And then through that, any returns then flow back into the public sector through the public banks. So just to wrap up here, then, our public-public collaborations in public banks and water, is it the way forward? And these are messages that are very, very strong. And I think there's some debate on the Sevilla document in terms of the debt versus other elements, but on the public development side, there was a lot to celebrate, I think, and I think many people are happy with the outcome document in that regard. But this certainly the message that MDBs can boost NDB capacity is there and should, and they'll be calling on the MDBs to do that. But that at the national development banks, NDBs, that they will have a key role in providing the local expertise that the MDBs lack. The emphasis on just transitions and working public development banks, pursuing policy mandates as opposed to profit maximization is in there. And signaling, clearly in this document that public development banks are really not going anywhere soon. They're a part of the architecture. They're growing part of it and an increasingly more central element of the international financial architecture. And that's where the member states have agreed to place them. So we'll probably see more co-financing among PDBs, but also in our research, we point to working with universal banks. But, and this is important to emphasize, there's nothing inherently good or bad about public development banks. I say this every day. They really only function as effective policy maximizers if they're commanded to do so by their owners in society. Just, the striking out of the statement there is not by mistake. When I wrote this, it was draft, but now the draft has been passed as the outcome document in the Sevilla commitment. And it's important to point out the member states' right that we will support the enhancing of the ability of MDBs and other PDBs, public development banks, to work better as a system, aligned with country-led development priorities and strategies. We will foster synergies based on comparative advantages, including through enhanced operational cooperation, joint programming, and co-financing arrangements, capacity building, and peer learning. And I think in many ways that captures much of what the title of this session is pointing towards and much of what needs to be done. And I think we'll be asking more of the world's public development banks in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. That was really excellent way of kicking us off for this session. And also, I really like the way you relate it to the current statement, the final outcome document from the Sevilla conference. So it shows that we're really at the heart of what is being sought after for the, for all sectors. And it is particularly relevant for the water sector. I also like the way you made the link with how MDBs can support, and that's a very good segue with Lionel's intervention, because you can tell us a little bit more, Lionel, about what AFD in the first instance decided to set up the Water Finance Coalition. What objectives were there? What were your early successes? And more generally, aside from the coalition, how can you support greater investment from national PDBs to invest more in water? Thank you, Lionel. Over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. I hope you can all hear me quite well. Well, actually, only 5 years ago, the PDB community was not structured at all. So we didn't even know how many PDBs there were around the world and how much they finance. So this is why for the first time in November 2020, the French Development Agency organized the first Finance in Common Summit in Paris, where 450 PDBs participated and gathered for the first time, actually. And in that context, there were a few sector coalitions that were created, and amongst them, the Water Finance Coalition, on which the PDB for Water initiative will now build on. And so we started back in 2020 with a joint declaration, actually, of only 4 PDBs, and all of them were international banks. So there was CAF, EIB, the World Bank, and the French Development Agency being the only bilateral bank. But as soon as 2020, when we were actually already 40 participants in the regular meetings we were organizing, and today that coalition gathers about 60 public development banks ranging from the international ones to the national ones and even subnational public development banks. So actually, we felt there was a need for peer exchange when we started. So this is one of the first activity we had. We organized this meeting, trying to raise a specific topic in each of them, offering the opportunity for the members to share their experience, but also their difficulties. And we had the support for over 2 years of IRC Watch as a secretariat, and I would like to thank them again for their contribution in structuring the coalition in that period. We also identified a few topics of shared interest, and we tried to provide support on them. For instance, we published a guide on how to better mobilize climate finance for the water sector, and we also published a first study trying to assess the share of water in the PDB's portfolio and see how big it was. Nevertheless, I would say that as for AFD and myself, I would say the key objective behind the Water Finance Coalition and now the PDBs for Water initiative is really to increase the activity of national PDBs in the water sector, having a focus on them. Why that? Because we know official development aid is not at scale. It has actually increased in the last 15 years, but now it stagnates and it even declined recently. And fortunately, some players and some of the major ones, including the World Bank, say they will increase their commitment in the water sector in the coming years. Only 2 days ago in Sevilla, there was a joint report from MDBs that announced they had done about 20 billion financing last year. So that is great. That is a lot. And maybe it will increase, but even if it doubles in size, it will still not be at scale compared to the sector needs. Then we have the private finance. That's also something to increase, to support. But today, well, the figures range between 2% and 7%, but it's very limited in any case. So even if we would manage to increase it 2/4 or 3/4, that wouldn't solve the issue of the underfinancing of the water sector. So what do we have? What other means of funding do we have? We have, of course, budget support. And Thomas correctly mentioned that they were key. Unfortunately, we know the context is not favorable, and previous commitments were not kept. We maybe remember the Itequini Declaration, where all African countries committed to increasing their budget support to sanitation sector, but it was not kept. So then that's why we have to look at the PDBs. And thanks to the Finance in Common initiative, we know that there are more than 300 PDBs around the world financing 2.5 thousand billion US dollars per year, which is about 10% of the global investment worldwide. So if all of them were financing 10% in the water sector, as you mentioned in your introduction, Sophie, that would lead to 250 billion US dollars per year, which is more or less at scale with the needs for reaching SDG 6, depending on what we consider. So this is what we really believe. We have a strong community here. So what do we expect? I would say in having OECD now taking a leading role in providing support to this community. Well, first of all, more visibility, I think, and also having the PDBs being more political, maybe. I think the voice of PDBs, thanks to OECD support, might be better heard, particularly in national conventions. And the first one, I would say, would be probably the next UN 2026 conference on water, where you probably know that the sixth topic has been added compared to the previous one, and it's on investment. So this is really a strong opportunity for PDBs to raise their voice and to get them more active in the sector. And also, I would say, to answer your question on what to expect maybe from OECD. You have several initiatives in the water sector, like the round tables and also the observatory on the investments in the water sector that you are setting up. So I think we can create a very positive dynamics between these initiatives, which all support the same purpose, I would say. And maybe to answer the second part of your question, so how, apart from that, what can we do as AFD, as other international financial institutions to steer more activity of national public development banks in the sector? Well, actually, we do work together quite a lot already, mostly through credit lines. So AFD grants credit lines to national public development banks, and these lines aim at supporting better environmental and social practices, for instance, or better SDG alignment, specifically on climate, for instance. But very few of these lines are actually dedicated 100% to the water sector. So, for instance, in Brazil, we have a BNDES in the panel. We have a credit line to BNDES, which actually finances quite a lot of water investment, but not only. So, compared to that, we are now structuring a new one with Caixa in Brazil, which will be 100% water, and that's great, but it is still limited. So, I think we can do more, but we have to remember that international PDBs are demand-driven. So also we need the national banks to express their needs for more support to entering the water sector. But this is very important, and it is also important from our perspective because of their ability to provide domestic currency loans, as Thomas mentioned, and which we cannot always do. So really, this is important to prevent utilities from supporting the currency exchange rate risks. So that's what not only the volume, but also their ability to do domestic currency loan is key to us. But apart from credit lines, I think we should also develop more co-financing. Co-financing is very usual amongst international players. So we go, several of us, supporting one project, but we don't do a lot of co-financing with national banks. So this is also something I think we could support. So this is the how to bring money, but also I think we have to do more work at corporate level to help them understand their bottlenecks and why they are not working in the water sector. We started that, as you mentioned. We've supported so far 5 national development banks in defining roadmaps, including with VDB, the Vietnam Development Bank, which is participating today. I think today the next step, and this is again, I think, an area of strong support we can expect from OECD. We can work not only with the bank, understanding their limits, but also at national level, because they are the shareholders, governments, and so we need to have them adopting relevant policies and committing to do more in that sector. So I think building on the expertise you have with the national dialogues in some countries, having national dialogues on the role of public development banks for the water sector will be hopefully also a strong benefit from your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you for that. Lots of food for thought here. And thank you for also engaging with the development banks that we have on the line, because as you said, it's demand-led. So the collaboration needs to be wished for from both sides. I think you, in the interest of time, I'll move forward to our next speaker, Luciene Machado, who's from BNDES, and as Lionel mentioned, has engaged then with AFD, but I'm particularly interested to hear about your experience in financing water security at large, I would say, because one characteristic of BNDES is you've been investing not only in water and sanitation services and infrastructure, but also on freshwater restoration, on the whole kind of large water cycle, restoring springs and restoring catchment, etc. So it'd be good to hear about your experience. But also we've heard about this, collaboration needs for peer learning. So it'd be good to hear from you if you think you're in a position to provide support to other public development banks to help them, inspire them in terms of how they could invest more in the water sector. Thank you very much. Over to you, Luciene.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, OECD and dear panelists for this practice section. for us at BNDES is a great opportunity to exchange the views and to see the difficulties everywhere in regards of water sector in general. Well, for sure, in Brazil, as you may know, we are still see eye to Thomas, to the scenario Thomas described in terms of the deficits that we are still enjoying in terms of water distribution and wastewater treatment. And for sure, we need as a National Development Bank to take into account especially the regional imbalances that it poses to us, and what kind of policies that we need to put forward in order to address or at least to mitigate those deficits. To just give you a flavor, in Brazil, there are still 17 million people which are not able to have access to potable water, and maybe almost 100 million people which are not able to access sewage treatment services in a reasonable and in a consistent way. So I'm saying that to tell you that the problem of underinvestment in the sector is really a structural problem that we are facing, not for the last 73 years, that is our age as a development bank, but maybe through the 19th century. So it's a very relevant challenge that we had ahead of us. That's why we give so much value to this kind of exchange of ideas and the initiatives that the OECD and the AFDs are putting forward through the last years towards this kind of interaction and collaboration among public entities in general. So what we are doing at BNDES, maybe we can describe this in two ways mainly, and maybe a third one that we are trying to emphasize more recently. But maybe the two ways that are more, I think, traditional for BNDES in Brazil, that would be first being this long-term financier for the sector, for sure, as far as we are still investing just a half of what is really needed for the sector to reach these universalization goals that we have in our legislation to achieve. There is not a task for one player. We don't see BNDES performing this alone or in a standalone basis. Just like Thomas said, there is no silver bullet towards this. We do see ourselves as a very important, I think, and relevant player in terms of the capability that we have to mobilize funds in proper conditions to sustain those investments in longer terms and in softer interest rate modes, for sure in domestic currency, because there is definitely a need for this kind of service in general, and in Brazil is not different. So we do see that we can do more nowadays. When we compare those kind of long-term credit to our credit portfolio in general, we are still reaching 5% of our portfolio, which is a very important, I think, improvement if we compare to 10 years or 5 years ago, but we are still lagging behind from the 15, maybe what would be our main target into this KPI. So for us, we do need to do this, I think, in a more consistent way. It's not really a problem of funds scarcity in this sense, not thinking about BNDES capability to work in the sector. Maybe the more traditional gaps for us are the lack of good projects. That's why we just trying to dedicate more energy in terms of this, what Thomas has qualified as public collaboration towards the subnationals and the federal government, in order to have good models of projects, good business plans for lots of the systems and lots of the investment that are needed. Otherwise, that will be difficult, not only for us to invest more in the sector, but also to mobilize more funds. And we do feel, as I mentioned before, that we're going to need any kind of help that we could mobilize in order to get closer to this SDG goal that we all have. So it goes to this second via that we are exploring, maybe through the last 10 years, but maybe more intensively through the last 5 years, that, well, BNDES is really joining forces with each and every state in Brazil and lots of municipalities in very big and regional projects towards water and wastewater systems, because we do know that regionalization for a country with continental dimensions and a lot of imbalances like Brazil is really crucial. Otherwise, that would be difficult to really dedicate the public and the scarce funds towards the regions and towards the portion of the services that would be served without them. So we're going to, in other words, explore more the private partnerships, what kind of roles and tasks private partnership could be more explored. It's really in the very beginning of the curve in Brazil. We are not exploring that far, and we feel that we could do this with good models, for sure, with a very important reinforce in terms of regulation. Otherwise, the experiences could be not good from the end users, and we are trying to do very consistent steps not to jeopardize this kind of pockets. We couldn't really imagine our tasks without the private pockets involved, the private investors, especially those ones that are very used to infrastructure in Brazil. We are in a very, well, challenging country in a macroeconomic point of view. We are a middle income country. We have lots of imbalances to deal with. So pursuing investors in Brazil is a task itself, as you may know. So probably in water and wastewater, we managed to reach a very important, I think, portion of private participation, coming from 3 or 5% in the beginning of the 90s. Now we reached 20%. But saying that, I come to my last topic, that would be the remaining 80 portion of the service, which is now in Brazil provided by the state-owned companies. The states in Brazil has put forward state-owned companies in the 70s. They were able to upgrade the services from almost from scratch to the levels that we are enjoying today. We do feel that this model has exhausted, so we need to work with them as well, not only to explore public and private partnerships they could forge, but also how could we as National Development Bank could really help them in order to upgrade their technical and institutional capabilities, and then asking them to help us in terms of the new challenges of the water sector, which will be more related to the climate transition that we are all enjoying. That's why you were in Europe above 40 degrees centigrades, and I'm here in Brazil at around 5 degrees centigrades in the winter, which are definitely not typical. So for water sector, we feel that state-owned companies in Brazil is a player that we can't just not consider. We do need, as a public bank, trying to forge this another public collaboration with them in order to understand how we could upgrade those very important actors in these levels that I referred before. So it may be the third via or third angle that, as a National Development Bank, we could explore. So thank you,
Luciene. I think in the interest of time, I'll move to the next speaker, because we have a lot to get through. But I think thank you very much for pointing to the imbalances, as you put it. The fact that there are very different needs. I mean, Brazil is a vast country with very different needs. So understanding the specific role that the public development banks, such as BNDES, and as you mentioned, all the other sort of subnational ones as well, either at the state level or at the regional level, can play, and how they can better collaborate will be very important. And understanding what is your your market base as well? Is it state companies, or is it sort of also private operators, and maybe a mix of both? So and there's plenty to discuss. Obviously, you have a lot of experience with the water sector. So I'd like to now turn to Trung and Nguyen Hoang. I hope I pronounce your name fairly correctly. But to tell us more about how you are currently working in the water and sanitation sector, but also perhaps more specifically in answer to what Lionel pointed out, what kind of support you've received from the Water Finance Coalition, and what are further sort of challenges you would need to address in order to scale up your operations in that sector. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's very nice to see some of familiar face here, especially our friend from AFD and also from South Africa. I believe that we still keep our memories when we attend the FIS meeting in South Africa several months ago. And so let me start our discussion today with some point of the TA activities that we have been go through with the water coalitions. Thanks to support of AFD, we got a very short and a small TA from water coalitions. We are doing analyzing advantage, disadvantage, and also the strong point policy over Vietnam Development Bank on the water financing. And based on the analysis of the TA, we found that Vietnam Development Bank is playing a very important role in Vietnam for financing the water supply, because 20 years ago, Vietnam was a less developed country, and we very much rely on the ODA resources for financing, especially for the water sector. And thanks to the supporting from World Bank, ADB, AFD, KfW, and some other donors, we got a lot of support, especially money from the ODA donors to financing for the water supply. And so far, VDB has around 500 million USD of the loan outstanding on the water supply with the money from World Bank, ADB, and AFD. So it's very good. But the TA analysis also point out that with the current situation of the Vietnam's economy, because now we became medium income countries. So the ODA donors discontinue with the soft loan to Vietnamese government, especially discontinue with provide the ODA to Vietnamese governments for financing the water supply, and not only water supply but also other sector in Vietnam. So we found that we still need that kind of money to continue to support the water supply and other infrastructure sector in Vietnam, because in order to have Vietnam to overcome the constraint of the medium income countries, because we expected in the next 20 years we would like to become a kind of rich country. So in order to overcome that constraint, we have to mobilize much more fund, especially long-term fund, preferential low-cost fund for financing our infrastructure, including water supply. So in conclusions from the TA of the water quality, we come to conclusion that VDB should play a bigger role in financing infrastructure in Vietnam and also the water supply. And in order to fulfill that bigger role, we need the support and collaboration with the multinational public and development bank for mobilizing fund for supporting our financing in Vietnam. Now come back to the other issues is that how we are doing right now for the financing water supply sector in Vietnam. So I think that Mr. Marois and also Mr. Goujon from the AFD has several times mentioned that we have been working with the AFD. Especially, we conclude one very important project in Vietnam. It was called Water Supply Fund for the Mekong River Delta in Vietnam, which is the value of 30 million euro. The project has completed, I think, 10 years ago, but it shows a very interesting story of Vietnam. 20 years ago, when we starting financing water supply by using ODA, we mostly financing state company because at that time, one of water supply company was the state company. And then we use a lot of money from the World Bank and ADB to finance the water supply and have them to privatize. So after 20 years, now owner of state water supply company, they became joint stock or private company. But then, when they are the private company, they only pay attention to commercial water supply project only. So it turned out the problem for the development bank, because if we continue to finance for those private company, as a quote, is very good. They have a bankable and commercial water supply project. But as you may know, the water is a kind of very special commodity. It's not only the commercial commodity, but also the public and initial service for the people. So if we only finance for the bankable project, then who will finance the less bankable and more public water supply project? Then it turned out that we still need a kind of collaboration with the local authority, and also we need a collaboration with the ODA donors to continue with the mechanism of using ODA. It means that we can use the low-cost money with a long-term fund to finance the less bankable project in some less developed area in Vietnam. So I think Mr. Goujon has mentioned already that we can use a kind of credit line, for example, from AFD, or we can have a kind of co-financing mechanism with the multilateral or development bank in order to have enough long-term fund and low cost for financing the water supply project in Vietnam. So I think that the very important point here that because now, for example, for AFD still continue provide loans to Vietnam, but now mostly focusing on the budget financing rather than project financing. So I think the very important point here is that as a national development bank, we wish to collaborate with the multilateral public bank for having a kind of credit line under the form of ODA, or we can have a kind of co-financing for financing less bankable project in water sector in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I think we need to move to
so
our
that
next
is the end
speaker,
of my presentation.
Yeah, thank you, because it really echoed the comments that Lionel was making in the introduction in terms of how to structure that support from multilateral development banks. And you also pointed to the same point that Luciene raised is, what is the specific sort of area of engagement of public development banks vis-a-vis other banks, particularly in contexts such as Vietnam or Brazil, where there's a move towards greater private sector participation in the sector. So a greater diversification of the type of players, but still the big, basic needs are there. And so that may be the segment that your bank needs to serve. So I'll now move to Johann Lubbe from Development Bank of South Africa. I guess you're, facing similar issues, and if you could tell us more about your portfolio in the water sector, but also about how you're working precisely with the government of South Africa in order to define what your niche and what you should target in terms of support if you are focusing on specific sub areas of the water sector. Thank you. Over to you, Johann.
Yes, thank you, Sophie, and good morning, everybody. I think to just give you a sense of what the Water Partnerships Office is doing is maybe just to firstly give some context. Within South Africa, the water services mandate lies with municipalities. So that's with local government. So the need sits with local government. Unfortunately, there are challenges in terms of capacity, expertise, funding available for municipalities to really deliver on that mandate. On the other hand, we've got a lot of expertise, capacity, and money and funding within the private sector, but we don't have the mechanisms to match these two. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. The private sector is often very eager and keen to participate and to provide funding, and we know money is not really our problem. We don't have the projects and the mechanisms for the private sector to invest in. So what the South African government then did is we looked at the success of the REAP program, the Renewable Energy Program. Some of you might be familiar with that within South Africa. And we said, how can we replicate some of those successes within the water sector? We know water and energy is very different, but there were a couple of elements that we thought we could bring into the water sector to try and create more opportunities for private sector to participate. And one of them was to look at things more from a programmatic perspective. And with that, the creation of the Water Partnerships Office. So the WPO was created by the Department of Water and Sanitation, which is the national water department within South Africa. And the WPO established as an agency within the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Now, our mandate is really firstly to develop standardized programs. We've got 6 programs, and I'll run through them very shortly. But the methodology behind that is really to create standardized documentation, mechanisms, models to allow us to do things easier, quicker, and more cost-effective. Municipalities often work in silos. The one doesn't know what the other one is doing. We aren't able to benefit from previous experiences, learnings. But by centralizing this and standardizing approaches, we are able to then benefit from previous experiences, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we do a project. And then secondly, within these programs, we then assist with the preparation of projects. So doing bankable feasibility studies, structuring projects, designing projects to get them to a stage where they can then go to the private sector for participation, whether that's through funding, through operation and maintenance, just general expertise and capacity from the private sector. We don't do that work ourselves. We still make use of consultants, but within our standardized approaches, we are able to then guide and manage the process of preparing bankable projects. So we're not, in essence, we don't invest into projects. We've got access to project preparation funding, but the idea is then to create projects and develop projects to a stage that it can then attract funding from private sector, but also from MDBs, DFIs, any investor, impact investors, equity investors, to then participate in investing in those projects. So very quickly, the 6 programs we have, the first one is a non-revenue water program. On average, municipalities in South Africa lose about 50% of their water. It's either through physical losses or through revenue losses. And that program will focus on assisting municipalities to reduce those losses. The mechanism that we make use of by involving the private sector is through performance-based contracts. With the private sector PBC contractor then also investing into some of the initiatives that's necessary to reduce non-revenue water. The second program is a water reuse program, where we take water from municipal wastewater treatment works, do further treatment on it, either for potable purposes or industrial or agricultural purposes. Also looking at generating energy from these facilities, beneficiating the sludge. All of those represent some form of revenue that can be used to finance your project. And there we're typically looking at PPP or project finance models. For the water reuse program, we've secured a significant amount of climate finance from the GCF, $235 million, which is comprises of a grant component to prepare reuse projects, and then there's also a concessional loan component to go into the investment of water reuse projects on a blended finance basis. Our third program is a wastewater treatment program. I think linked to reuse, but we don't always have a reuse opportunity, and some cases we just need to treat the effluent to the right standards before we discharge. Many of our wastewater treatment works in the country are failing, and that program will really focus on upgrading, refurbishing, and rehabilitating wastewater treatment works. The fourth program is a non-sewage sanitation program, which is looking at scaling new sanitation technologies, water efficient sanitation solutions, typically for schools, informal settlements, and so on. So that program is really focusing on scaling these solutions. We've secured some funding from the Gates Foundation to support the establishment of that program and really rolling it out at a larger scale. And there we're looking at typically independent sanitation provider solutions, where the private sector provides that service on behalf of government or municipalities. The fifth program is a seawater desalination program, which focuses on procuring large volumes of desalinated seawater from the private sector, either through PPP or IWP models. We're just at an early stage now, starting to design that program, starting to developing the standardized documentation, etc. And then the last program is a management contract program, which is not a directly investment-related program, but more bringing private sector capacity in to help municipalities to operate their water business in a more effective and efficient way. So those are the 6 programs. We're trying to develop and build a pipeline of projects within those programs to then, as I mentioned, ultimately get them to a stage where the private sector can participate. We know South African government cannot do this alone. We have to bring in the private sector to fund alongside the development banks in order to really make an impact on this. Maybe just lastly to also mention, we're also working on designing guarantee instruments for some of these projects. The moment that you talk to the private sector about investing in a municipal project, they ask, where's the guarantee from government? Our national government is not giving guarantees to local government. So we have to look at other options, and we're looking at designing program guarantees for some of these programs where projects can then benefit from those as a mechanism of credit enhancement. But I'll just end there for now. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks a lot, Johann. This is very interesting. So the fact that within the development bank itself, you are looking to address the limit that Luciene was pointing out, for example, in terms of lack of definition of proper projects that you can support. So you're taking that in-house. And I suppose that leads us as well to the last intervention, because there's plenty of questions that I hope we'll have a bit of time to discuss afterwards. But I wanted to bring in Josefina, who can tell us more about the AquaES model, which is also looking at helping with project preparation and financing as well. So a more integrated model, which can provide inspiration for developing countries where these limitations are clearly at play. So over to you, Josefina. Thank you for your patience.
Not at all. Thank you very much for inviting us to present this model in Spain. Well, in Spain, we have a state investment water fund. This is a dedicated investment fund which was created in 1996 at the time of the privatization of the main public industrial conglomerate. You can pass it on if you can. The fund has at this moment 4,500 million euros, the total equity, so it's quite a lot of money. What the government did was not to use the money when they sold the companies to the private sector, when they privatized the public sector. What they did is to create these companies for specific issues, and one of them was water. So it is an experience with a long track record. It's not an experiment. It has been working for a long time. And it has been successful in mobilizing water investments. And since 1997, it has cumulative investments of 4,324 million euros. It invests more or less around 387 million euros in a given year for water projects, which is more or less 17% of the total state water investments. So again, it has been mentioned before, it is not the only source of finance. There are other sources of finance. There are public budgets, which sometimes they are used to co-finance the projects that the water fund is investing on, but they're also used for other investments that may not be suitable to this type of model. So next, please. So what is special about this fund? Because the OECD was asking me, what can we say there that is different? Well, this is a fund which is managed by the state public water companies. So it's a little bit different from other state water companies. This is not about building and contracting. This is a fund which also has other functions, but it's mainly a financial instrument. So there are two state water companies. One of them is AquaMed, which operates in the Mediterranean basins, and that's mainly desalination, simplified. And AquaES, which operates in other basins and mainly investments for regional and local authorities. We were seeing before, in the case of South Africa, the problems of the local authorities. So here you had an instrument from the state government to try to help and invest in their types of investments that they need to be done. So these companies are part of the public asset group, so the public conglomerate of the Ministry of Finance. And there are some limitations on the types of projects to be funded because they need to be approved by the Council of Ministers. So there's a long list of projects that need to be funded, that need to be approved by the Council of Ministers. And these projects also have been included in the national water plans or in some kind of formal medium-term agreements with the regional authorities. So there is a context. It's not just one by one somebody asking for a project, but it has to be in the context of this type of institutional structure. Next, please. What is special also is that it is a revolving fund. So it keeps its value over time. It is continuously replenished by income from funded projects. So there is a need for cost recovery. I think we heard this before, that some projects may not be able to cost recover. And tariffs are calculated project by project. It does not have any fiscal year limitation like the public budget. So you have this 5,000 million, but it doesn't mean that you have to spend it every year. No, it is true that all the funds need to be allocated to projects because they're approved by the Council of Ministers, but they don't need to be spent on any given year. So it adapts to the project cycle. So, and it does not count as public debt. So this is all very important. The issue of cost recovery, I understand that it may limit the types of projects, but as you can see in the next slide, there is some ways of going around that. Next, please. What is special about this fund also is it attracts all the sources of finance. It is a mechanism for blended finance. In this framework agreement, you know, these for 5,000 million euros, how they are allocated is that basically 1,000 in the case of a specific case of one of the public companies. So there's two, as I told you, the Aquamed and Aquaes. In the case of Aquaes, the equity of Aquaes is invested, is used for 30% of the total cost of the projects. There is expected to be 1,000 million from commercial banks, 1,900 million from EU funding, and then there is also capital transfers in advance from water users or from the water directorate itself or other regional governments. So there may be, which will be like a specific subsidy. So even though you are talking about revolving fund that needs to be repaid, really the only parts that are repaid are the Aquaes equity and the commercial banks. But everything else, the European funding and the other public sector funding, then they are not. So in the different projects, the mix is different, although more or less is 30, 20, and 40, and 10, the rest of the funding. Next, please. Specifically, what is special about this fund is the commercial funding has a specific role. So the managing companies, they have a line, or a financial line with commercial banks that are secured by their own equity. I think we were mentioning this before how you can use the equity of the public banks to have better interest rates or better conditions. And this line is open and is activated project by project. So the companies don't need to, they have a credit line, but they don't need to use the credit line or pay for the interest of the credit line until they're actually activated by the different projects. The line of credit is negotiated with preferential interest linked to the Euribor, but basically they get better interest rates than other companies, or even what Johann was saying before, even the local authorities. No, you can get a better conditions with the commercial banks than you will get by the local authorities. So in terms of this commercial funding, you have to pay the interest rate, you have to repay the loan, but you also have to update, there is an update index for the loan's value, so it doesn't depreciate. Okay, next, please. There is also, what is special about this model is that there is also project preparation, contracting, and management. So what it happens often is that you have, on the one hand, the financial institutions, and on the other hand, you have the projects institutions, and there is no way, because we are always talking about this issue of the bankable projects, and then we are all lost in the process. So the question here is that the management companies of this fund, they also have a project facility for project preparation. They have a project management, so they can manage building and operation, and they also do the project finance. So they put together what is the mix of the projects. Some projects, for example, like a wastewater treatment plant in a small municipality, will be very expensive if they have to recover all costs. So you will have regional governments and the water directorate from central government co-financing so that the costs are more affordable. Next, please. And finally, there is control of investments by a management board and a shareholders board of the public companies, and they are subject to annual independent financial audits and control. Interesting, the management board, it has 11 members, but they are appointed by different ministries. These are high-level civil servants normally, so they are not political appointees. And the presidency of this board is the Ministry for Ecological Transition, which is in charge of water. And finally, just in conclusion, the next one, this is an innovative funding model because it's very often seen things like that in the context of Spain. It's a revolving fund, and it facilitates blended finance. It complements public budgets. So it doesn't do everything. It's not the only instrument for the investments of the central government, but it does complement other ways that the central government does their investment. The repayment of revolving fund and commercial finance is agreed with beneficiaries. Projects to be funded are approved by governments in the context of plans, and there is a system of checks and balances in place. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Josefina. So for pointing out, the existence of alternative models, because obviously public development banks is one way of accelerating investment in public finance. And Lionel, as you were pointing out, we need to find these ways, these underutilized actors in order to accelerate financing to the water sector. There's been a very live discussion, I can see in the Q&A, and a lot of the comments and questions have been answered directly. So I won't pick up on all of the different questions that were there, but one that struck me and that perhaps allows us to go back to our keynote speaker, Thomas, is the fact that you are calling in there and you're referring to the Sevilla statement, outcome statement, on the need for new models, potentially creating new type of municipal development banks, or to address this inequality aspect that several speakers have pointed out. So perhaps you could comment on that live. Do we need new actors, bearing in mind that all of these institutions take time to set up? It's already quite a crowded environment. Do we need new development banks or new perhaps funds which have an in-house capacity to help develop projects, as Josefina was pointed out? It'd be good to hear your reflections on that. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I was quite surprised about the language in the final outcome document calling for the creation of new public development banks around the world where there weren't one or where there was a particular need for them. But repeatedly in the last few days, at quite high-level panels, this same commitment has been made, the need to create new sorts of institutions. And, there's often a question of, is something a public fund? Is that fund then a public development bank? It's sometimes hard to kind of disaggregate them. The fund, I guess it's a fund, Josefina, I'm not sure, acts very much like a public development bank, and it seems, really quite interesting. But I think, from all that discussion, what is really important is also the recognition in the document and many of the discussions that if there is the creation of a new public fund or development bank or municipal development bank, that reflects the needs and the aspirations of the community, that it shouldn't be something that is parachuted in on a community. And this is actually something I'm working on right now in Canada with various actors. We have some local funds similar to what Josefina is describing, but there's a lack of a national municipal development bank owned by cities, for cities, similar to the Nordic models, that are quite simple entities, but have a lot of capacity to just borrow in international markets and to lend directly. And the one really strong one that we have in Canada at provincial level actually has higher credit ratings than the province or state itself. So it has a AAA credit rating, whereas the state, the province in which it's held is slightly less than that. So there's quite a bit of variation, but interest in this, and I think a lot of care has to be taken in the creation of new entities, that they really serve a specific purpose and are well governed and well created.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I think this issue of how the different entities interact with each other and collaborate with each other is key, right? In terms of how they own land, and because each of them can build on their own expertise. I think one topic that has come up as well in the discussion is that of guarantees. I was struck by your comment, Johann, that you say that the government of South Africa doesn't provide guarantees to subnational governments. But then several of you have pointed out to the needs of these guarantees to be provided in order to help development banks engage, because many of them are very cautious to maintain their AAA rating or their good rating. As you mentioned, Thomas, the one in the provincial bank has a high rating, so maintaining that rating is important. I was wondering, maybe Lionel, if you could comment on that, like who do you think can provide those guarantees? Is there a role for multilateral development banks there? And bearing in mind what you've heard also from Vietnam, how do you think your support as a bilateral bank could be structured better, perhaps, or in a different way in order to support those efforts?
Thank you, Sophie. First point as regard guarantees. The thing is, they have been existing for quite a while. I mean, within the World Bank Group, and more recently, we could name the EU push with the 14 billion in guarantees for development. And obviously, their use remains very limited in the water sector. We do have a guarantee scheme at the moment based on EU delegated funds, which cover the water sector, but the demand has remained low, like with a couple of projects. So, I mean, I think that's because these guarantees do not offer an improvement in the risk assessment, which makes such a strong difference. So you gain maybe 1% in the end, depending on your risk level. So it doesn't make a project to come from a non-bankable to bankable category. I think maybe guarantees we should dig more into money exchange rates guarantees. They are not developed enough so far, and I think they would be a stronger instrument in the sector. So, and definitely, this EU program lags behind in terms of disbursement because the lack of demand. So this is, I mean, still a bit surprising. We have to dig into that, I think. As for Vietnam, I mean, I noticed with interest the evolution of the financial tools that our colleagues from VDB mentioned. I don't have such a long history as he has on our intervention in that country. But I mean, as I said, we respond to the demand. So I guess also Vietnam was asking for project support in the beginning, and it is a normal evolution of a country becoming more developed, more autonomous, to ask for budget support rather than project support. The issue is that usually when you have a budget loan for the water sector, the money doesn't go to the water sector because it's not tracked. So it goes to the treasury, and then the water sector goes out with commitments of improvement, but do not always have more budget support. So this is maybe one key issue to look into as well. What we are developing more recently in AFD, instead of going through the state, is it's kind of a budget support, but for the utilities themselves. So we call them transformational loans. So instead of financing predetermined specific investments, it's more corporate loans with targets, which can be either in terms of realization or for internal transformation. So, and in that case, at least we know who will be implementing the money.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you. And I mean, we almost running out of time, but so I won't have the opportunity to engage with all of you, but I just wanted to go back to Luciene about what you heard as well from DBSA in terms of project preparation and ACWES, because you did mention this lack of well-prepared projects. So does that provide food for thought? Is that something that you could consider doing within BNDES? Is it already happening?
Oh, very, very insightful, I think, tool. We do feel that we try to engage with some kind of participation in specific funds. The question that we always are posing to ourselves is, what is the best role to our own funds in doing that? That will be more equity driven, or that will be long-term debt related. So those aspects that we need to understand better. What would be the more, I think, burning demands from the projects and from the private investors that could step in if we manage to put forward those tools. So, but sounds very, very interesting, and I really didn't know that we have all those possibilities. So for us, it's quite insightful, as I mentioned.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I wonder if there are any burning comments from the panelists, reflections that you would like to, before we close the session. Lionel, you've gone off mute, so go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. Very quick word. Good luck to OECD for steering now this initiative. We're still around. AFD has been very committed in supporting the voice of PDBs in the water sector, and we will of course remain committed. I'm so happy to see other public development banks around. We can feel the topic is kicking now. So. I'm confident that OECD will help us now enter a new area of more visibility and more impact with that tool, which I believe really has the potential of having a strong impact on the sector.
Thank you, Lionel, and thank you for your support. So we'll do our best to sort of effectively bring new life into this coalition. As you say, it's a very high on the agenda topic. It was great to be reminded by Thomas about how high it features in the Finance for Development agenda. And you also pointed out to the UN Water Conference, Lionel. So in effect, next week there will be the announcement and vote on the interactive dialogue themes. There's this sixth theme that has been put forward on investment. And clearly, that's where we are planning to integrate greater discussion on the role of public development banks. This, because it needs to be articulated not only at the banks level, but also at the level of governments, so that they can understand how they can best support the whole network of development banks in their country at national level, subnational level, the various levels of government, maybe all the way down to municipal development banks. So it's a rich ecosystem that we need to understand better, and it's a system thinking approach, I think, that we all need to adopt in order to understand how the parts of these ecosystems can better work together, so as to foster all the different types of investments that we need to support. And Johann, your classification of areas where project support is needed was very interesting, I felt, because these are the areas where there is clear investment needs in the sector, and where we need a push. So thank you very much for your participation. We will release, put the findings and the discussions online. Didn't have a huge number of participants. It's been, I know there's a lot of competition between events, but we are taking good notes, and will reflect that in the thinking going forward for this Public Development Banks for Water initiative. Many thanks to all of us and to all of you, and looking forward to engaging with you in the future.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
See you next time. See you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.